They believed they were following the truth, but the truth wasn't waiting for them on the battlefield. It hid in the silence that came afterward. War in feudal Japan didn't begin with a sudden strike. It began with an order, with a whisper in the village, with a heavy glance from an elder. People knew the road was coming, not because they wanted it, but because there was no way to refuse. They didn't march toward glory. They marched because there was no other path. First came the preparations, slow, awkward, wordless. Then, the journey. It lasted for days, sometimes for weeks. What wore them down wasn't the battle, but the waiting. The roads were harsh, wet, slippery. Every step drained strength. Horses struggled. People stayed silent. Food ran out quickly. Anyone with something warm was considered lucky. As the army drew closer to the battlefield, the silence changed. It held more tension than shouting ever could. No one knew how much time was left. Only the faces changed. Everything unnecessary disappeared. What remained were eyes and breath. Some closed their eyes, as if hoping to wake up somewhere else. But that never happened. The real battle looked nothing like the legends. People didn't charge at each other with proud cries. They didn't raise their swords in triumph. Everything was tight, grounded, anxious. Spears were gripped too hard, shields trembled in hands. Some thought of home, some thought of food. But no one knew how long they could keep standing. When it started, there wasn't time to understand where the enemy was. People got lost in the noise. The fight felt like a storm. Everything blurred together, footsteps, strikes, fear. Those who fell often didn't get back up, not because they were weak, but because they simply couldn't. Victory went not to the strongest, but to the one who held out the longest. After the battle, peace didn't come. Emptiness did. No one spoke, no one smiled. Victory brought no relief. It left a silence in which everyone could hear only themselves. People sat on the ground, staring at a single point. They knew this wasn't over yet. The stories that followed spoke of bravery, of honor, of glory. But those stories didn't include the ones who stood in the mud, unable to feel their hands. They left out how hard it was to breathe under heavy armor. They forgot those who never came back. Only names remained. Only heroes. Only the tale. They hoped the battle would bring them meaning, but meaning was the first thing to disappear. They had been taught that the way of the samurai was the way of honor. But that spring, the path was different. Slick, heavy, full of silence and stone. Before the battle could begin, one had to reach it. And it was that very journey that broke people long before the first strike. In spring, the rains turned the roads into swamps. Horses slipped. Warriors sank knee-deep in mud. Every step was a trial. Every mile felt like a day. Even the strongest grew weary before they ever saw the enemy. But they had to keep walking. There was no turning back. Weapons pulled at their shoulders. Armor soaked up the moisture. Their bodies gradually stopped obeying. Their backs ached. Legs throbbed. Thoughts blurred. And ahead, only the unknown. On either side, silent faces just like theirs. No one knew what the next day would bring, or if it would bring anything at all. They slept directly on the ground. If they were lucky, beneath a tree. If not, under the open sky. Fires weren't always lit. Sometimes the rain made it impossible. Sometimes it was too dangerous. They ate quickly, plainly, barely chewing. Sometimes they just swallowed, just to have something in their stomach. The bread was hard. The water, cold. No one complained. Words were used only for what truly mattered. Along the way, they lost more than just strength. They lost people. Some slipped, some fell ill. Some simply didn't get up. No one could carry them. The march didn't stop. The commander didn't look back. In those moments, the road revealed its harshest truth. It wasn't strength that mattered most, but motion. Stop, and you were gone. even if the day before you'd led the way. The entire army moved like a single slow, creaking machine. No shine, no songs, only the squeak of straps, the thud of boots, and the constant drip of rain. Sometimes someone coughed quietly. Sometimes someone dropped a piece of armor. Those sounds spoke louder than words. The landscape didn't change. Mountains, a river, fields. Then mountains again. Time faded. People stopped counting days. Only the body remembered. Pain again, weight again, soaked boots again. But no one asked why. They just kept going. Because anything else meant the end. When they finally reached the place where the battle was supposed to happen, not one of them looked like a warrior. They were soaked, exhausted, silent, not ready to fight, ready to collapse. But there was no pause. The commanders urged them on. The enemy was near, action was needed, and when they arrived, the battle had already been decided without them. They had prepared to hear the clash of swords, but what they heard was something else. Footsteps, pounding, breathing. Everything except the battle itself. The clearing was empty. The wind barely brushed the grass. The trees at the edge stood silent, like witnesses. The men stood in rows, as if carved from wood. Their spears trembled, but not from cold. Every heart pounded too loud. Every breath came with effort. It felt as though time itself had stopped breathing, unwilling to be the first to break the stillness. No one knew how it would begin. No one wanted to be the one to take the first step, but no one could leave. Standing at the edge of a battle, they understood. There was no road back. Only a line remained, between before and after, and each of them could feel how close they were to crossing it. When the enemy appeared, they didn't scream. They walked, calm, certain, as if everything had already been decided. That silence was more terrifying than any cry. It crept into the heart, pressing from within. The men stood tense, like drawn bows, but no one fired. They waited, to see who would fall first. Everything began in an instant. Not with a command, not with a strike, but with movement. Someone surged forward, and the rest followed. The lines dissolved. Order vanished. Chaos erupted. Shouts tangled with the sound of steel. The blows weren't precise. They were fast, clumsy, as if each one was striking not the enemy, but fear itself. Swords didn't sing. They slipped, jammed, broke. People fell nearby, and no one had time to tell. Were they wounded, killed, or simply off balance? The battlefield quickly became a narrow corridor where each man fought just to not die first. Visibility vanished. The air was thick with dust and sweat. Everything pressed close, too close. Shields offered no safety. Armor only got in the way. Victory didn't go to the best trained. It went to the one who could keep breathing, the one who could endure more, the one who didn't fall when others already had. Warriors clenched their grips until their fingers went numb. The strikes came at random, without calculation, just forward, just to survive. The ground wasn't a field, it was a trap. It slid beneath their feet, pulled them downward. Every step was a struggle, sometimes a final one. People tripped over bodies, over stones, over roots. Some didn't get up, others did, only to fall again. The world narrowed. Nothing remained but the fight, and the hollow, ringing space inside their minds. The commanders were the first to vanish. Their words drowned in the noise. Without them, everyone moved as best they could. Each decision was their own. Each man bore the weight of his own survival. There was no one left to trust. Looking around, you didn't know who stood beside you, friend or foe. Everything blurred. Everything lost meaning. When the battle began to fade, it didn't happen all at once. The steps just became fewer, the screams quieter, the blows slower. People were still standing, but they no longer moved, Hands dropped, swords slipped from their grip. Some dropped to their knees. Some simply lay down on the ground, even if they weren't wounded, even if they could still stand. The battlefield stayed silent. It did not celebrate victory. It accepted exhaustion. Those who remained didn't raise their heads. They felt no triumph, only a weight in their chest, and a strange, quiet feeling, as if something inside had gone completely empty. They didn't know who they had defeated, but they knew exactly who they had lost. The chronicles spoke of armor and valor, but they never wrote about what lay beneath. And beneath it was a man, with a body, with hunger, with doubt. The samurai in the scrolls stood tall, composed, with his head held high. His armor gleamed. His posture spoke of calm and strength. But the one gazing at the scroll didn't know what it really felt like to wear that armor. It pressed down on the shoulders, restricted breathing, rubbed raw against the skin. After an hour, it was hard to turn. After a day, it was hard to breathe. Life between battles wasn't quieter, nor was it easier. It was simply different. Less blood, but more weight. Mornings didn't begin with meditation. They began with stiff, heavy movements, with fatigue that didn't fade overnight. You slept wherever there was space, sometimes under a tree, sometimes beside corpses. The armor was rarely removed completely. It took time, and time was scarce. Food was rare. Meals were quick, cooked over fire. Most often, rice with whatever was on hand. Sometimes only rice, sometimes nothing. Those who were fast enough ate, those who weren't chewed air. Stomachs growled louder than voices, but complaints weren't welcome. Hunger was accepted, part of the path. Illness came suddenly, without warning. Coughing, fever, pounding heads. People slowed down, their eyes turned cloudy, their hands shook. But no one left. To leave the unit was to disappear. Weakness was not forgiven. It was hidden, silenced. It festered under the armor, alongside the sweat, the filth, the exhaustion. Conversation was minimal. Only what was necessary. Only what mattered. The rest stayed inside, where no one could see. Thoughts circled around simple things. Where to find food, where to stay dry, how to save strength. No one thought much about battle. It always came uninvited. Sometimes the warriors looked off into the distance, to where there was no camp, where there were fields, villages, ordinary life. Not everyone wanted to kill. Many simply didn't want to die. But there was no choice. Duty stood higher. The system was stronger than desire. Those who disobeyed vanished. Sometimes quietly, sometimes in front of others. Honor was a word that sounded noble. It was painted on banners, repeated in temples. But in reality, it brought no warmth at night. It didn't lighten the burden. It didn't ease hunger. It was a destination. But the road to it led through darkness. And not everyone made it. Sometimes, walking beside you were those who no longer believed. They never said so. They just moved slower, stared at the ground. Their shadows were shorter, their steps quieter. They still fought when called, but not for glory, only because there was no other way. Armor gleamed only in the scrolls. In reality, it was dirty, scratched, soaked with sweat. But beneath it, there was still a body, alive, beating, bent, real. And each day, it rose, strapped on the plates, and walked forward, toward a place where stopping was not an option. Honor was still there, but with each passing day, it grew heavier. The chronicles spoke of armor and heroic deeds, but they never told what lay beneath. Beneath it was a person, with a body, with hunger, with doubt. On the scroll, the samurai stood tall and firm, head held high. His armor gleamed. His stance spoke of calm and strength. But the one looking at the scroll didn't know what it truly felt like to wear that armor. It pressed down on the shoulders, restricted breath, chafed the skin. After an hour, turning became hard. After a day, breathing did. Life between battles wasn't quieter, nor was it easier. It was just different. Less blood, but more weight. Mornings didn't begin with meditation, but with heavy movements, with a fatigue that didn't leave during the night. Sleep came wherever there was room, sometimes under a tree, sometimes beside corpses. The armor was rarely fully removed. It took time, and there was never enough time. Food was scarce. Cooking was quick, over open fire. Usually rice with whatever was available. Sometimes only rice, sometimes nothing at all. Those who were quick ate. Those who weren't chewed the air. Stomachs growled louder than words, but complaining wasn't done. Hunger was accepted, just part of the path. Illness struck without warning. Coughs, fever, pounding heads. People slowed down, their eyes lost focus, their hands trembled, but no one left. Leaving the unit meant disappearing. Weakness wasn't forgiven. It was hidden, silenced. It built up beneath the armor, alongside sweat, dirt, and exhaustion. There was little conversation, only what was necessary, only what mattered. The rest stayed inside, where no one could see it. Thoughts circled around simple things: where to find food, where to stay dry, how to hold on to strength. Few thought about battle. It always came on its own, without asking. Sometimes the warriors looked away, toward where the camp was not, toward fields, villages, ordinary life. Not everyone wanted to kill. Many simply didn't want to die. But there was no choice. Duty stood above all. The system was stronger than desire. Those who disobeyed disappeared. Sometimes silently, sometimes before everyone's eyes. Honor was a word that sounded beautiful. It was written on banners, repeated in temples, but in reality, it didn't keep you warm at night. It didn't make the march easier. It didn't quiet the hunger. It was a goal, but the road to it ran through darkness, and not everyone reached the end. Sometimes, walking beside you were those who no longer believed. They never said it aloud. They just moved slower, looked at the ground. Their shadows were shorter, their steps quieter. They still fought when needed, but not for glory. Only because there was no other way. Armor only gleamed in the scrolls. In reality, it was dirty, scratched, soaked with sweat. But underneath, there was still a body, living, beating, bent, real. And every day, it rose, pulled the plates back on, and walked forward, to a place where stopping was never an option. Honor was still there, but with each passing day, it grew heavier. Sometimes the battle ends, but the silence that follows can be even more terrifying. Victory is not announced with fanfare. It doesn't arrive with light. It doesn't sound like music. It's not carried on banners. It comes slowly, in the emptiness that remains afterward. There are no cheers in the camp, no laughter. People just sit, hunched over, staring at the ground as if something has been lost, and they can't quite tell what. The day is over. The sun sinks beyond the horizon, unwilling to bear witness. Smoke hangs in the air, between people, between trees, between past and present. Everything feels slow. Everything feels unfamiliar. Even sounds, even footsteps, even breath. Those who returned were not the same. They didn't carry blood. They carried silence. The kind that lingers when there's no need to keep moving, when the goal has been reached, but something feels missing. Something important, something the whole journey was for. But it's no longer there. Fires burn, but no one warms themselves. Food boils, but no one truly eats. Hands move out of habit. Eyes stare through the flames. Everyone in that camp is trying to understand. What now? The battle happened. Victory, supposedly, too. But there's no joy, no relief, only weight. The wounded are many. They're laid out side by side, on straw, on soil, on scraps of cloth. Some groan. Some no longer breathe. Some just stare upward, their eyes unblinking. Those treating them no longer ask names. They look at the wound, at the breath. If there's a pulse, they bandage. If not, they move on. The dead are placed aside, without words, without farewells. Just to make space. There's no cruelty on the faces, only exhaustion. The kind that doesn't let you sleep, even with your eyes shut. At night, no one walks loudly through the camp. No one pats a shoulder. No one says, "You did well." Everyone understands. It wouldn't change a thing. Armor has been taken off, swords set aside. No one cleans them right away. That can wait. For now, the only task is to sit, to survive the night. Because inside, it's not empty. It hums, like a cave, like a bell. And that hum doesn't fade. It stays. And you have to sit with it, until morning, until light. Sometimes someone begins to speak, in a whisper, one word, then another. But no one replies. Not because they didn't hear, but because they don't know what to say. Nearby are those who were there, who saw it, who will never see the world the same way again. Their eyes speak louder than any words. Victory, it turns out, doesn't heal. It doesn't stitch wounds. It doesn't bring the dead back. It doesn't erase fear. It only shifts the direction. There's no more fighting to do. Now, it's about returning. But how? With what? In which direction? There's no answer. Only the fires. Only the shadows. Only the night, which extinguishes everything, except memory. The next morning, they said nothing, not out of mourning, but because they no longer knew what they were living for. Spring began with rain. It didn't stop for days. It soaked into the ground, into clothing, into bones. Drops beat against helmets, against cooking pots, against faces that no longer showed surprise. Everything was wet. The road, the clothing, the bread. Boots sank into mud. Tents tore loose in the wind. Fires wouldn't catch, and no one knew how long it would last. When the rain gave way to sun, it got worse. The air turned heavy. Steam rose from the ground. People struggled to breathe. Sweat poured even at night. Mosquitoes swarmed anything alive. Skin itched until it bled. Wounds festered. Even a scratch could turn dangerous. Water didn't cleanse. It made everything slippery, sticky, heavy. In summer came the heat. Not the kind that warms, the kind that crushes. At midday, it was hard to move. Heads spun. Lips cracked. Water ran short. Those marching in heavy armor collapsed from heat before ever seeing the enemy. The gear became a trap. Armor didn't protect the warrior. Shade protected him from the armor. Forests seemed like shelter, but they held new threats. Dampness clung to the body. Food spoiled fast. Mold grew on tents. Animals came closer to the camp, especially at night. Sometimes to snatch leftover food. Sometimes to attack. No one was surprised to see a fox creeping toward the fire, or to find a man missing from the camp, and never found again. Autumn brought mud. Wet leaves hid the trail. Moss-coated stones, turning each step into a risk. The cold crept into bones, but hadn't yet turned deadly. It only reminded them winter was coming, and those already tired wouldn't make it in time. Winter didn't arrive all at once, but when it did, breathing hurt. At night, ice sealed buckets of water. Armor froze against the skin. Boots stuck to the ground. The frozen bodies were cleared in the morning. Those who fell asleep on snow didn't always wake. Even near the fire, there was no warmth. Only smoke. Only crackling. Only the memory that the day had once been slightly less cold. Disease walked without weapons, but struck more precisely than any blade. The belly softened. Skin went pale. Eyes turned glassy. A man still breathed, but no longer moved. They left him. Or he stayed, beside a tree, a hill, beneath the blanket of sky. Somewhere it was easier to stop fighting. Nature chose no side. It didn't care who would win. It simply did what it did. The wind tore down banners. Hail shattered carts. Thunder woke those who had just fallen asleep. Lightning struck spears. Sometimes, men. The earth gave way. Avalanches, mudslides, floods. Everything was the enemy. Sometimes stronger than any army. Commanders drew up plans, positioned units, but they couldn't change the wind's direction, or seal the sky, or force the sun to be gentle. In this war, the first blow was almost always dealt by nature, and more often than not, it was the decisive one. No one expected the enemy to come from above, but that's exactly where it came from: the sky, the rain, the fire, and the cold. When an army sets out on campaign, they count banners, spears, helmets. They form ranks, raise symbols, issue commands. Everything looks precise, disciplined, confident. But along the way, many things disappear, and not always by the sword. The first to go are those who caught a chill. Just rain, just a night on damp ground, just soaked shoulders. By morning, he can't stand. The commander looks past him. The others march on. If there's water, they leave it. Sometimes they leave nothing. He's not a hero, he's a delay, and delays aren't waited on during a march. Someone slips on a stone. Someone breaks a leg in the mud. Someone simply collapses from exhaustion and can't get back up. Not because they're weak, but because strength is not endless. They shout, "Get up!" He nods, tries, but can't. They walk around him, without anger, without words, without farewell. There are those held back by fear. It doesn't scream. It doesn't pale the face. It drips inward, slowly, drop by drop, until it becomes too heavy to carry. That man walks slower, stares off to the side, sleeps little at night, gets lost during the day. Sometimes they find him later. Sometimes they don't find him at all. Those who fall along the way don't make the lists. Their names are not recorded. Their faces are never drawn. They're not mentioned in the stories. They don't become part of the songs. They never reach the battle. So it's as if they were never on the march. But they are the backdrop. They carry the weight of the road. On their shoulders, the tents, the food, the water. Their hands stretch the ropes, haul the loads, clean the weapons. They earn no glory. But without them, the formation doesn't move. Without them, the army is an empty shell. When someone disappears, at first it's noticed. Then it's accepted. Then no one asks. Too many are missing. They go one by one, quietly, unseen, not on the battlefield, but on the trail, on a slope, on a bridge, beneath the roots of a tree, where there are no drums, where darkness simply falls. Sometimes they're replaced, sometimes not. The gap in the line is filled by another, but inside, something stays behind. Those who saw a man vanish carry it with them. They don't speak of it, they don't share it, but the mark is there, in their eyes. And the farther they march, the more eyes bear that mark. There are days when dozens don't make it, sometimes hundreds. But people still speak only of those who fell with swords in their hands. The rest remain outside the tales, outside remembrance. They become part of the road, part of the wind, part of those who almost made it, but didn't. They died silently, as if they'd never been there at all. But it was they who bore the heaviest burden, the path no one noticed. History doesn't forget. It simply selects. It erases what doesn't fit neatly into the lines, what doesn't sound beautiful. With time, everything becomes simpler. A battle turns into a date, armies into numbers, victory into a line on a scroll. Everything that was once real becomes part of a story, without dust, without pain, without people. Only names, only order, only outcome. Those who survived kept silent. No one asked them. They had no place to speak. They returned home, built houses, raised children. On rare evenings, they stared into the fire, sometimes longer than usual, sometimes too long, but no one asked what they saw. The chronicles were written by others, by those who had never marched, never stood in the mud, never lost a friend. Their hands were steady, their parchment clean. What mattered to them were dates, names, heroes. They needed everything to make sense, every death to have meaning, every blow to have a result. A story that could be read in a night and remembered forever. That's how victories were created. That's how faces disappeared. What happened between the lines was left nowhere. No one wrote how many didn't make it, how many died from the rain, how many froze, collapsing on the trail, how many simply vanished without even a cry. Those numbers weren't recorded. Those voices weren't preserved. They didn't fit the story. Over time, the songs grew louder than memory. Names were repeated with reverence. Deeds became cleaner. Swords gleamed. Voices rang firm. No one trembled. No one faltered. Victory became noble. Defeat, honorable. Everything in between was lost. Children memorized poems about battles. Shrines raised plaques. People bowed before names. But they didn't know who stood behind them, who ate dry rice the night before the fight, who lost a brother and kept walking, who stood in the rain, unable to move. These faces faded the fastest. They weren't in the texts, only in memory, and memory fades with those who remembered. Sometimes someone tried to speak, to one person, maybe two, but the words came out dim, too plain, uninteresting. People turned away. They wanted glory, not truth. They wanted the myth. And myth has no room for pauses, for weakness, for silence. Myth demands shine. And shine does not walk beside mud. And so history drifts away from time. And time turns deaf. It moves forward without looking back. It wipes away the tracks, replaces experience with image, suffering with a paragraph. And decades later, everything appears tidy, logical, complete. In a way, it never truly was. What didn't make it into the chronicles didn't disappear. It remained. In the shadows, in the ash, in the breath no one ever heard. When the battle ends, when the banners are folded, the swords lowered, and the faces of those who were part of the march just yesterday fall silent, it may seem like everything has reached its form, victory, result, conclusion. But in truth, that is when it begins. Because true silence doesn't come when the noise fades. It comes when meaning does. They marched to win. They fought to survive. They died without knowing why. And when it was all over, they felt no relief, no pride, no joy. Only emptiness. An emptiness so deep, even pain had vanished. Only the shadow remained. A trace. Something that can't be explained to anyone who didn't stand beside them. No one taught them how to live after. No one explained how to return to homes that no longer existed. How to look into the eyes of those who had waited. How to lie down knowing they lived not because they were stronger, but because someone else happened to be one step ahead, a half step to the side. And that was enough for them not to come back. History did not keep their scent, their voice, their gaze. The one that carried everything from the first day of the march to the last night. Not a deed, not a plan, not a victory, but the person himself. Warm, exhausted, worn down, and still walking. Walking to the end, even if no one had promised there would be one. Years later, when candles were lit in the temples, when scrolls were unrolled before students, when they were told how the castle was taken, how the army triumphed, how the clan was honored, no one mentioned those who collapsed on the road from fever, who died in camp from infection, who lay down in the mountains and never reached the battlefield. They existed outside the story, outside the diagrams, outside the history. Memory chooses. It can't hold everything. It keeps what echoes, what is easy to repeat, what fits neatly into the shape of a hero's tale. The rest sinks into soil, into smoke, into bodies that never found a place. And only sometimes, in the voice of an old soldier, in a face that suddenly changes, in the pause between two words, you can hear what wasn't forgotten but cannot be spoken. The world they lived in wasn't about glory. It was about the road, about hunger, about aching backs, about water that ran out, about sleep that never came, about fear that couldn't be shown, about exhaustion that never left, even after returning home. And there was no weakness in that. There was truth. When the last fire burned out, when the final weapon was laid down, when the army finally ceased to be an army, another battle began. The silence inside each man. A silence that wouldn't let him forget, but wouldn't let him speak. And that silence is where the war remained. Not in the victory, not in the scroll, not in the date, but in the empty space inside the man who walked through it and lived. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it doesn't speak at all. Sometimes it just stands beside you, in your breath, in the dark, in the memory of those who are no longer here. And if you listen closely, if you pause, if you stop rushing to label and conclude, you might hear not a story, but a shadow, not an ending, but a pulse, not history, but what was beneath it. They didn't fight for honor. They fought because there was no choice, because the way back vanished faster than the way ahead. If this story moved you, trust me, the next ones will go even deeper. You'll hear what no one else is telling. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. If this video spoke to you, leave a like, a comment, and most importantly, share it with someone close. Until next time.